Hi, my name is Canaan Linder, and today I'll be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This presentation is my final project for the class, U.S. History, 1945 to Present, taught by Dr. Hutchings. I'll be breaking this presentation into four main parts. First are the basic facts, in which we will go over the general details about the Cold War and more specifically the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then we will delve into some primary and secondary sources about the Cuban Missile Crisis from both the American perspective and the Soviet perspective, hoping to glean some insight into the Cuban Missile Crisis and how each government reacted behind the scenes. So who was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis? On the American side, two of the main players were John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert. JFK was the president at the time, and his brother and right-hand man, RFK, was both on the president's executive committee and the attorney general at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nikita Khrushchev was the premier or leader of the Soviet Union at this time, and Anastas Mikoyan was the Soviet ambassador between the Soviet Union and Cuba. He handled the negotiations between Castro and Khrushchev, and we'll talk more about him later. Also, Andrei Gromyko, was the Soviet ambassador to the United States. Again, we'll go into more detail on their two roles in the Cuban Missile Crisis. When was the Cuban Missile Crisis? It was 13 days of October in 1962, lasted from the 10th until the 24th. Cuba is located 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and its proximity to the United States, as well as being part of Latin America, or South America, will be one of the main reasons why it is so important to both the United States and Soviet Union. So why did the Cuban Missile Crisis happen? The Bay of Pigs incident in 1961 was an incident where the United States, and more specifically the CIA, tried to invade Cuba and overthrow the communist dictatorship. We'll go into why that was such a big deal and why that led to missiles being placed in Cuba. But the main part of that was this issue of deterrence, where the Soviet Union, seeing Cuba as an ally, as a communist ally, did not want the United States to invade it again and placed missiles there to deter the U.S. from even touching the island at all. Cuba is very important to both the United States and the Soviet Union for a couple main reasons. Firstly, South America had not been popularized yet with one of the ideals, either communism or capitalism, and both the Soviets and the United States saw Cuba as a gateway into South America and figured that if they could get Cuba on their side, that the rest of South America would follow. Proxy wars were fought by both sides at the time. This wasn't an actual war, but the whole mindset of if America goes to Cuba, the Soviets will go to Cuba, and vice versa, happened all over the world and led to many conflicts being fought in other countries, but actually being between the Soviet Union and the United States. Cuba's proximity to the United States, being 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was a huge concern to both the president and his executive committee. Having missiles pointed at Florida and being able to reach the mainland United States from Cuba is obviously something that the president would not allow happen. So the book, The Cold War, A Brief History, written by John Lewis Gaddis, is a brief history about the Cold War and briefly touches upon the point of Cuban Missile Crisis. And I wanted to extract two quotes from Gaddis's analysis because they really emphasize some of the key main factors of the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. So the first was, Nikita loved Cuba very much. This was said by Castro, and Nikita being Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, it became very apparent to Castro that while his island may have been small and not look like a big player in the whole Cold War, he realized the value of Cuba and how his own allegiances affected the United States and Soviets within the world and the rest of South America. So he used this as a bargaining tool with the Soviets, and we will see later how he was kind of overstepping his bounds in some of the demands he made from the Soviet Union. The second quote is, "Just what Khrushchev intended to do with his Cuban missiles were, even now, unclear. It was characteristic of him not to think things through." This is a quote more describing Gaddis's analysis, in which many of the decisions Khrushchev made during the Cold War, and specifically this decision to put nuclear missiles in Cuba, was a little rash and not very thoughtful. Both after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it came out that both Khrushchev and Kennedy did not want nuclear war, which begged the question, why did Khrushchev put nuclear missiles in Cuba in the first place? Being a very provocative act, there were many ways to deter the United States from invading Cuba without putting very destructive and many destructive missiles 90 miles from its border. Unlike Gaddis's brief history of the Cold War that touched briefly upon the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 Days is all about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and is written by Robert F. Kennedy, who was the president's brother, a member of the president's executive committee, or ExComm, and also the Attorney General at the time. We see a more personal approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis that we're not privy to in a overview like Gaddis gives us. So we're first introduced to the Cuban Missile Crisis when the president and his executive committee is sitting and receiving a report from the commander of the Air Force that says the U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba have seen missile sites being built. This was obviously taken very provocatively as an act of aggression by the Soviet Union, because the Soviets, were wanting to put missiles directly pointed at the United States, right next to the United States. President Kennedy called Gromyko, who was the Soviet ambassador to the United States, and asked, why are the Soviets putting missiles in Cuba? One main thing, though, is he did not present pictures of the U-2 planes had taken, because he did not want to tell Gromyko that the U.S. had planes flying over their allies, Cuba being the Soviet Union allies' territory. Gromyko assured President Kennedy that there are no missiles in Cuba, there are no missile sites in Cuba, and there would never be any missiles or missile sites in Cuba. Now this highlights a main theme between the Soviet Union and the United States that I want to highlight, where the Soviets wanted to appear powerful, and they did not want to let the United States dictate anything they did, and because of this, they lied straight to President Kennedy's face. They did not want to act weak, and they were going to put the missiles there regardless if Kennedy knew about it or not. Now, on the other side, the president, many instances, asked his brother Robert, who the book's point of view is from, what do I tell the American people? What do I say in my speech? Because, the Soviets are saying they're not putting missiles there, but the pictures from the U-2 planes contradicts their statements. So what do we tell the American people? In this theme of truth versus lies, the Soviets on one side wanting to act strong and powerful and lying to do so, and the United States saying, oh, we just want to tell the American people the truth because, we don't want war and this is how we're going to resolve this crisis, is a stark, difference between the Soviets and the U.S., and it's really highlighted greatly in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, there were two main things that Kennedy could do to react to these missiles being placed in Cuba. One was a blockade, where ships could, form a ring around Cuba and make it almost like a quarantine zone where no ships from the Soviet Union were allowed to pass and enter and unload in Cuba. The other was an invasion, which was not as favored because while they could have tactically striked all the missile sites, there would be no guarantee that they could hit them all fast enough so that no missiles would be fired at the United States, which could lead to, all-out war, if not the invasion, destroying all the missiles, but still causing a war in the process. A blockade was chosen ultimately by John F. Kennedy, and it was lucky he did, as the alternative could have led to nuclear war. So the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 13 days, there were a few main points that I want to go over. So the first was that the United States take out missiles from Turkey and Italy. Turkey and Italy were very close to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union found it, offensive that the United States had missiles right next to it, pointed within its own borders. The Soviets obviously wouldn't send any atomic or more missiles to Cuba. As we'll go over, this kind of alienated the Cubans and made them angry. But again, I'll cover that in the next slide. The United States makes no "we win" declaration, which I alluded to on the last slide, where the Soviet Union wanted to appear powerful, and any statement by the U.S. that said, like, "Oh, look, we made the Soviets do this, this, and this," would be in contrast to that. And President Kennedy told the newspapers very harshly not to publish anything that would make the Soviets look bad in this resolution. And the United States won't invade Cuba like they did in the Bay of Pigs. This achieved Khrushchev's deterrence policy. The letters between Khrushchev and Kennedy were just, a series of truthful letters exchanged after the war that basically said that they agreed. They never wanted nuclear war, and both were very happy that this, very dangerous revolution was, this very dangerous crisis was coming to a close. Not everyone was happy with this resolution, and Cuba in particular did not like that the Soviets were, as they said, negotiating with imperialists. I thought the word imperialist was actually very interesting. We hear the term imperialist referred to the United States today in the context of what's happening in the Middle East, and I thought it was very illuminating that this term, was, used in the 1960s by Fidel Castro. The Cubans thought of, or regarded the Soviets as deserters. They thought they were abandoning them in a time of need. So the hardline Russian supporters of Khrushchev were like, "How on earth are you negotiating with the other side? We put these missiles there to look strong, now we look weak." The U.S. allies in Europe, the U.S. was mostly keeping the European allies, not in the mix, or not updating them on the situation, and that angered some of them. This resolution, though, did lead to some good, where the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty in 1968, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty basically is a statement saying that the use of atomic weapons, the testing of atomic weapons, the spreading of atomic weaponry and technology other than atomic energy should not spread. Atomic energy and atomic power should not be used for war purposes, because it stemmed from the fact that both Khrushchev and Kennedy realized the world would be destroyed if it ever came to nuclear war. So in the book written by Sergei Mikoyan, who was a secretary to his father Anastas Mikoyan, who was the ambassador from Soviet Union to Cuba, we learn a little more about the Cuban Missile Crisis from the Soviet perspective. For the interest of time, I won't be going over everything because it overlaps with 13 days, but I want to go over some of the key points that were not brought up in 13 days, mostly because the United States didn't know about them. So there were actually 100 nuclear missiles in Cuba. These were smaller missiles, more like warheads, that were attached to surface missiles, but still could have, done quite a bit of damage. And because the United States didn't know about them, the Soviet Union actually planned to leave them in Cuba. However, Castro's behavior made the Soviets actually withdraw the missiles. So Castro actually told his ambassador to the United Nations to use these nuclear warheads as a bargaining tool if he needed to. The Soviets couldn't take this and described his behavior as obstreperous, which basically means, cannot be controlled. As I said, the U.S. didn't know about the missiles, and this last point about the independent variable goes back to his obstreperous behavior, because the Soviet Union really wanted to use Castro as a tool and as a pawn, and wanted to have him be a dependent variable, basically do whatever they told him to. Castro did not want to do that. He regarded himself as, a leader, and if these missiles were in his country, he could say what to do with them, and for all intents, be an independent variable, contrary to the Soviets wanting him to be a dependent variable. So, on the analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was the time that the world had ever come the closest to nuclear war. This was the only time in the history of the world where two countries had nuclear weapons pointed at each other, and were many times during the course of the crisis right next to the button and ready to launch them at each other. This also, there were many things learned from the war, and I would say the biggest thing was nuclear weapons should not be used as a form of deterrence, because as Khrushchev and Kennedy both realized, the price of nuclear war is too high for deterrence. There are things bigger than, letting communism spread, letting, Western capitalism spread. The fate of the world is in the balance, and that is not something you play over with nuclear weapons. It's not good. Don't use them as a form of deterrence. There are ways to achieve what you want by using less dangerous means. Actually, the Cuban Missile Crisis surprisingly led to the world being a safer place, both because the leaders of these two, huge nations realized what they were about to do when starting a nuclear war, and realized that could not happen. Also, treaties such as the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty in 1968, stopping the spreading of nuclear weapons to other countries, as well as in 1962, the ban on nuclear testing in the atmosphere, which saved much of the environment as well as tons of land, which moved most of the tests to underground, which was a big deal considering that the US and Soviets and the Chinese and many other countries combined ran thousands of tests up to this day. So that is a big part of an outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here are my citations. Thank you very much, Dr. Hutchings, for teaching this course. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great rest of the year and in the other courses you teach.